Hi, welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I'm Noel, I'm your host, which I presume you know by now, but I'm just reminding myself because it's too early in the morning for this stuff. Got a great guest with me from Eating Freely, Emma Murphy, who's joining me from Ireland. I'm very grateful for your time this morning to discuss a very serious mental health issue around disordered relationship to food. And I'm just going to state very clearly, because I had this conversation with her before. I'm not a great fan of sort of 12-step approaches to food disorders, although I'm in 12-step recovery myself, and I rarely talk about that, but that's the truth. And so I'm really keen to get Emma on because I think that we have to have evidence-based approaches to these disorders because they're very, very serious stuff, and I'm not against people getting support groups. Absolutely fully support that. But the model of practice around eating disorders needs to be rigorous, evidence-based, and the people practicing need to be accountable. That's my ethical statement there. And I'm a regulated health professional, so I'm coming from that perspective. Sorry for the political soapbox to start you off at this time in the morning, Emma, but I think it's really important, to be honest. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Noel. And I mean, I am also a regulated health professional, so that's important. And I agree with what you say. I suppose for me, the problem is not so much that I mean, there are a lot of people out there who talk about a disordered relationship with food on social media and put themselves forward as experts in that area. And of course, that's absolutely not right. And I would always say to people to just check somebody's credentials, but ask them what their qualification is, ask them what body they're regulated by,
Yeah.
or what membership organization they're a part of, who actually stands over them, who do you complain to if that person doesn't
Yeah.
serve you? That's one thing that I would always say.
Yeah.
Particularly in our niche, and I started off as a full disordered eating specialist working with anorexia, bulimia, compulsive overeating, and then emotion binge eating. And emotion binge eating is by far the most common form of eating disorder.
Yeah.
And yet people don't realize that it actually is an eating disorder. So that's the niche that I ended up kind of really specializing into over time. Um, and that is the one that you will see, if you're on Instagram, if you're on TikTok, so many people talking about it, so many people posting about it, and so many people who do not know what they're talking about. Um,
It's so proper, because I'm going to go back in time as I always do with people and find out a bit about you. But tell me the definition of emotional binge eating disorder. What is it? And the other ones that you use, the anorexia, the bulimia. Just give us the headline sort of
yeah.
diagnosis,
Okay.
criteria.
So, the spectrum, very broadly, I would say anorexia, bulimia, emotional and binge eating disorder, and then compulsive overeating. They're the main four. That's where you're going to be on the spectrum.
And these are defined in ICD-10 and DSM and things like that. Is that
They're in
right?
the DSM-5, yes, would be the diagnostic, Bible that we use.
Yeah.
Binge eating disorder, which is where we work primarily, that only came into the DSM-5 in 2013. So it has actually only been a discrete diagnosis in its own right for just over 10 years. And yet, still, so many health professionals do not know what it is. They do not recognize it. They do not diagnose it correctly. And they absolutely do not recommend the right treatment protocols for clients or patients. So that's something that I.
Here in the UK, it's a significant issue because we often hear patients talking about having gone to see their GP, which is first point of contact. 80% of healthcare is via a GP. And I'm not criticizing GPs here. They have a lot to do. And keeping up with the ever evolving world of mental health diagnosis can be a challenge because, as you know, the US is always inventing new ones for their insurance purposes more than anything else. That's
Yeah.
another soapbox I won't get on to. So let's have those diagnoses. Give us a very sort of clear what is what.
So anorexia, I think, is the one that people know the best. If you
Yeah.
say eating disorder, people think anorexia. They think of a young, thin woman
Yeah.
who is not eating and is like, you can see her ribs, she's very thin. So anorexia is effectively um highly restrictive. So you're not eating. You're avoiding eating if at all possible. That's really, you know, the bottom line with anorexia.
Around avoiding calories.
Well, it's avoiding anything, like,
or
you
is
know,
it?
although I would say it's interesting that you say avoiding calories. When I was in college, when I went back to retrain in the area of psychology, there was somebody in my class who had anorexia at the time,
Yeah.
and we used to see her eating pieces of paper in class, you know,
Yeah.
literally just to kind of try and fool her body into thinking it was eating something,
Yeah.
but it was, you know, she wasn't eating it. Now that's very extreme,
Yeah.
but you know, that was what she did. But that the anorexia is the, you know, the extreme under eating. Obviously medically underweight. A woman will have stopped her periods because the body has had to shut down a system because there isn't enough energy to go around. And it has a mortality rate. So that's the really important thing about anorexia. Up to 20% of sufferers will actually die as a direct result of anorexia, and that is going to be through multiple organ failure. So that's anorexia.
And just a quick question there, because we often hear this thing, and given that I've got you, I'm just going to double check it, that anorexia has one of the highest mortality rates, if not the highest mortality rate of any mental health
That's
disorder.
correct. That's correct.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, you might think, you know, you think about mental health, you don't think about a mortality rate at all, actually.
Yeah.
You know, it does. I mean, maybe you might think of suicide in the context of depression, maybe, but you know,
hopefully that's quite low, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, but like anorexia, it is a mental health disorder, and that's actually one thing that really annoys me, is that they're called eating disorders in the first place, because they're not eating disorders.
Yeah.
You know, it's a mental health disorder. But yes, the mortality rate, the death rate in sufferers is 20%, which is extraordinarily high, to be honest.
It's enormous.
You know? Yeah.
It's an enormous death rate. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if people understand just how awful that is.
Yeah.
You know,
the fifth,
and
like, which is, that's a lot. If you think of any disease state or any, you know, condition that you could be struggling with, any chronic condition, there's no other condition out there that would have a death rate as high.
right.
You know, so it is very, very high. Bulimia then is where somebody is alternating between, they could be restricting, but they're also binge eating, and they're using what's called inappropriate compensatory behaviors. So, and they are aimed at reducing weight gain as a result of the binge eating. So the client is potentially usually restricting, then binging, and then using an inappropriate compensatory behavior. So the one that we think of most often when we think of bulimia is somebody making themselves sick.
Yeah.
So purging, that's called purging. But they also might abuse laxatives. They might be taking prescription drugs or non-prescription drugs. So a fun fact, I used to work on the airlines many years ago when I was in my early 20s. I went to the Middle East and flew with an airline for a couple of years to travel the world. And very high incidence of eating disorders in the airlines back in the day, because you actually, back then, they used to weigh you and measure you every year. And you have to be within a certain weight category. You know, you have to be glamorous and, you know, kind of, so very high incidence of eating disorders on the airlines. And a lot of the girls would go down to Thailand and buy the blue pills, and that was speed, amphetamine.
That's right. Yeah.
Amphetamines, people might take cocaine, people might take, and so all of these things, laxatives, cocaine, amphetamines, prescription drugs, non-prescription drugs, anything that the person thinks is going to suppress their appetite or increase their energy so that they can burn off calories. And the other one that people are very unaware of, Noel, and even a lot of health professionals miss this one because it looks like healthy, is
gym stuff.
Compulsive over-exercising.
Yeah, the gym stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
So if the client is like, have to go to the gym for 2 hours every day, or they have to go for their run every single night, or they continue to exercise even though they've injured themselves, that's a clue that there's something going on there, that actually exercise is their form of purging. Now, it's very rarely their only form. Usually they will also be, you know, maybe making themselves sick, or using laxatives or whatever it is. Now, again, with bulimia, a lot of people don't realize this. There's also a mortality rate associated with bulimia. And again, it's quite high. It's 10%. 10% of bulimia sufferers will die.
Sorry, it's just shocking.
Yeah.
I've been a mental health professional for 30 years now, and like, we don't let people die, but it is shocking that these figures. You
Yeah.
know, it's really appalling stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with bulimia, it's a heart attack. You're more than likely to have a heart attack.
Yeah.
And that is because with the purging and the laxatives and the exercising, and when you think about all of those,
Going up and down, going up and down, going the stress.
it's the stress on your heart, and it's also the electrolyte imbalance. That's what's actually you're going to have a heart attack because of the electrolyte imbalance.
Right.
Far less common is to have an esophageal tear if you're vomiting.
Yeah.
You know, and that's very dangerous. But you know, really,
And those,
it's the
particularly
heart attack.
the vomiting, purging, is also often associated with anorexia. Is that correct?
Well, you would have clients who would be who would have anorexia and would be starving themselves, you know, highly restrictive, but anything that they do eat, they might also try and purge that as well. Yes.
With
So that's
laxatives.
even more dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also bulimia is often described as you look okay,
Yes.
but it's your behaviors behind the looking okay that
Yeah.
are the determinant. Is that
So
correct?
bulimia would be the hardest one to, I suppose, visually see.
Yeah.
That's because in anorexia, the client is going to be underweight.
Yeah.
In binge eating disorder, compulsive overeating, the client is potentially going to be in a bigger body. And in bulimia, quite often the clients will be of what we would call a normal weight. Now, the whole area of weight-related health is very loaded at the moment, and we're trying to find person-first language and not to pathologize people and not to use words that people find discriminatory or shaming. So even the word obesity is up for discussion at the moment. People are looking at and kind of saying, you know, you talk about obesity, the obesity crisis, and you know all of that. We're trying to find words that, you know, don't shame or judge people, because there's so much shame and judgment around eating disorders.
Yeah.
And, you know, also those old thoughts that people have, you know, if you're slim, if you're a normal weight, you're healthy. And if you're in a bigger body, you're unhealthy. And that's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous cutoff.
Yeah.
BMI, it's gone out the window. It means nothing. You know, we really have to find a far more inclusive way of speaking to people about their weight and their health. And really, and in eating freely, we don't look at weight at all. We do no weight loss. That's never anywhere on our agenda. It's all about health and well-being. Like, you know, let's put your health and well-being, your mental health, your emotional health, your physical health, and they are our markers. And it's nothing to do with what size your body is. So binge eating disorder,
then the other end of the spectrum, which is
binge eating disorder. Then obviously almost all the criteria for bulimia and binge eating in bulimia are the same. The only difference is that somebody with binge eating disorder isn't purging, so they're not doing any of those behaviors. So binge eating is defined as being eating far more quickly than normal, eating until feeling uncomfortably full, like way past the point of physical fullness, eating in secret, eating alone, night eating, and really two of the most important criteria when you're describing a binge eating episode is that the person will very often feel out of control during the episode. So they don't feel they have any control over it. And a lot of clients would have told me over the years, it's like an out of body experience. It's, you know, I don't realize I'm doing it until I'm doing it.
It's more like disassociation, isn't it?
There is a form of disassociation with it. Yes, absolutely. At times. Now that's not, I mean, you know, Noel, like in any diagnostic criteria, we have to be flexible around that. It's not everybody's going to tick all the boxes. So sometimes the clients absolutely do know what they're doing, and they're doing it for a reason, and that's fine. But, you know, we just have to be careful around that. A client isn't always going to have that disassociated kind of, you know, out of body experience, but it's a very common feature. And then the other common feature, and this is where we separate out emotional eating from binge eating disorder.
Okay. Yeah.
Because everybody emotionally eats, and I'll talk about that in a second. But with binge eating disorder, it's the feelings the client feels afterwards. So the client is feeling disgusted, ashamed, guilty, you know, angry at themselves, and they hate themselves. So very strong emotional words. And this isn't just, oh, I'm a bit disappointed that I did that. This is like, you know, I'm devastated. And that is the difference between, so first of all, if I'm sitting down in front of my telly on Wednesday night and I'm watching Love Island with my daughter, and, you know, I've had a dreadful day and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I'm going to treat myself. And I go out
let's get the ice cream out.
yeah, I eat the family size bar of dairy milk on my own, and
Yeah.
then, half a tub of Ben and Jerry's, which I never would do, but yeah, that's, I know what I'm doing. Like, I know I've had a bad day. I'm treating myself. I know I'm not going to feel great after this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Um, that's fine. I will feel physically maybe not great afterwards, and that's okay. But I don't feel disgust, anger, hatred at myself. I just draw a line under it and I go to bed. I get up the next day and I get on with my life.
Yeah.
Where our clients, every time this happens, it's almost devastating. And this is why it's so important to really understand binge eating disorder, and why, again, calling them eating disorders is, I mean, really, to me, they should be called trauma disorders, because it's
Right.
all about trauma.
Yeah.
So the majority of clients have experienced some sort of event in their past, usually in childhood. They weren't able to, for whatever reason, they were not able to turn to their primary caregivers, usually their parents, because quite often the problem was happening at the parent level. There was something going on, like maybe mum or dad was an alcoholic, mum or dad suffered from severe mental health issues, diagnosed or undiagnosed. Very common in Ireland that it was not diagnosed. And I'm 56, so I was born in the 60s. I grew up in Ireland in the 70s.
Yeah.
But there was no such thing as mental health. There was no such thing as counselling. I mean, if you had a problem,
Same in the UK, to be honest. I'm the same age as you. So I grew up in the UK from Irish parents, but also it was exactly the same. We didn't have the language, we didn't define it. And even today, you still get these idiots on television talking about snowflakes and all this nonsense and this very shaming language, which is so counterproductive. Particularly from blokes who look like me and are my age as well. I'm just like, I can't bear them, to be honest. As far as I'm concerned, young people I want to make this statement. Young people these days are amazing. The fact that they focus on their health and well-being, good luck. Seriously. I wish
absolutely. They're far more aware than we are. They're also under far more pressure than we were because of social media and all of that. But they're far better. And men, we are slowly getting better at encouraging young people to speak up and speak out and talk about their mental health. But
let's go to this trauma thing, because I think it's really important that we nail this one down. I'm totally with you. The evidence about the role of trauma in all sort of mental health struggles is growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. It's not all about trauma. It's not all about parental failure or anything like that. We can have inherited issues, and we can inherit trauma as well.
Absolutely.
As an Irishman, that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as an Irish, someone in Ireland, having done, having worked in this area for, between study and working 25 years.
Yeah.
And having gone more into actually the spiritual side of it over time, and I would have been quite rigorous back in the day. I would have been very evidence-based and reading the books and, studying the literature. And, I would have, if you'd mentioned energy work or Reiki or anything like that, I would have, I'd have been like Reiki, Shmeiki. And, over time, I began to really understand the importance of understanding our spirituality, which is different from our religion or our, that's nothing to do with religion, but it's about understanding who we inherently are at that spiritual level. Who am I as a person? It's the existential question of what's the meaning of life? Why are we here?
And also we have things like meditation, which is spiritual practice, which has transformed healthcare. I mean, for goodness sake. So we have to learn where we need to learn, right? And I remember when I was training, we had a health anthropologist. He was a professional of anthropology, and he told us a story about a psychologist who was working in South America. And on one door he had a witch doctor, on the other door he had psychologist. Okay.
Absolutely.
And it was just a really interesting question about where you meet people. Coming back though to trauma, and because I think it's really important to make this point that there are obviously, when we talk about the possibility of childhood trauma and stuff like that, people will feel maybe a little defensive about that if they have children who've subsequently gone on to have mental health issues around food. And they may feel like a finger is being pointed at them, but that's certainly not what's going on. And it's an understanding that A, these things can be inherited. B, your child is born with constitutional setup anyway, and so what you might have done might have been okay for another child, but not for your particular child. because of their constitution and makeup. Also, it's often situational. I worked for 15 years as a senior manager in social services, dealing with child protection. Mostly the failures were ignorance, they were intergenerational, people were not being nasty and unpleasant. They just didn't know any better. And as
No,
soon as they
never.
were educated, they knew loads more.
Never. It's never the parents' fault. Like that's never about pointing a finger and saying you let your family down, or you let your children down. Absolutely not. And by the way, certainly when I was in practice, my average client, if you looked at all of the clients that I had, the vast majority of my clients were between 35 and 55, and I would say even more of them were between 45 and 55 by the time they came in.
Yeah.
And they had been struggling for decades with their weight, their body image, their food. They had learned this behavior as a child, as a coping strategy. So if you think about, and again, just speaking in the Irish context, and it's really interesting now that we're training practitioners in other countries and hearing of other cultural backgrounds and other cultural contexts, which again is very important. But in Ireland, the top 5, traumas that I would hear about all the time, or adverse childhood experiences that came up over and over again in the room, were obviously to have a parent who's an alcoholic.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I actually prefer ACEs as a concept rather than
adverse childhood experience. Yeah,
I think they're much more evidence-based. I don't know what you feel, but I think they're much more evidence-based, and they're also emotionally a bit more distant. So we can look at them and understand them, that these happen a lot. So sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I mean, different words, different, some people do identify with the word trauma, realize that their childhood was very traumatic. And then if you say adverse childhood experience, then, of course, a lot of the work, Noel, is putting it all into context and explaining to the client that, what's happening today as the adult, the 47-year-old woman they are today, or man that they are today, goes all the way back to when they were a child of 7, and whatever was happening back in their family. But if you have a family system or family situation where somebody is, for whatever reason, not able to fully function as a parent and a caregiver, to form an appropriate attachment with a child, to be present, and also we talk about, emotional intelligence was a word that came out. I think it's Daniel Goldberg wrote the book, but Goldman, about emotional intelligence. It really is important that we do have emotional intelligence. But if somebody is in addiction, if somebody is struggling with severe mental health, if they could have severe depression, or they could have bipolar disorder, or borderline personality disorder, or narcissistic
poverty,
disorder, they're not available. They're not available to a child to be there for them. And also, if their behavior is chaotic, or it's unpredictable, or if they're violent, or if there's a lot of anger, that child, grew up in an environment where they never knew which way was up. They never knew what was going to happen next. They never knew, when the next thing was going to kick off. And so they learn to keep themselves to themselves, to protect themselves, to stay quiet, to, just really kind of come into themselves and rely on themselves for their own emotional regulation and soothing. And that's where the food comes in, because when you're running out of...
Let's define that a little bit more, because I think that's quite central concept, this notion of overly self-reliant too early. Too early in life, before you're really ready equipped for it. Because self-reliance is a good thing as an adult, self-soothing is a good, but when you're a child, tell us more about that, why that is so disastrous.
So, I mean, if you think about, Mary as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old girl, and very often in our clients, it's not always the case, nothing is ever like, there's no set, presentation, but it's very common that a client with eating disorders would be the eldest in the family, or the eldest of their gender, so the eldest boy or the eldest girl, and so they're taking on responsibility in the house. Now, another factor that comes into this in Ireland in particular, Noel, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but contraception was actually illegal in this country until the mid-80s.
Yeah.
So I went to school. I was born in Drogheda, and I went to school in Drogheda, and then I went to school in Newbridge. And it was only when we came to Dublin I went to secondary.
My dad's from Newbridge.
There, my dad probably knew your dad.
Probably we're
Punches
better
bag
off
and
with the
everybody knows everybody. So you and I probably played together, Noel.
We're probably cousins. I'm sure we are.
Probably. But I was sitting in a classroom in Newbridge with, so many people in my class had 9 brothers and sisters, 11
Yeah.
brothers and sisters, 15 brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Like, we had big Catholic families. And our client was very often the eldest or the elder son or daughter, the oldest son or daughter. And what happens there is, so Mary's growing up, her dad is an alcoholic, okay? Maybe he's violent, maybe he's unpredictable, and so the family never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And Mary's mother is dealing with trying to, rear 9 kids on her own.
Yeah.
Because her husband is absent and, he's just not there emotionally for her. He's not there to do the work. And Mary gets kind of drafted in to support her mother.
Yeah.
And take responsibility for some of the younger children in the household. So it's a divide and conquer sort of situation where, I looked after the younger kids. So Mary, at an age, 7 or 8 years of age, is taking on really inappropriate responsibility. She's responsible for younger children at an age where she's not still absolutely only a child herself. But there's also an emotional dependency that can happen with Mary's mum as well. So Mary's mother, maybe because her husband isn't available to her, she, whatever, because the alcohol is there, she's relying on Mary. So we often see that our client might have been pulled in as a substitute spouse, so to speak, and might have become the confidant.
We don't mean sexual, we mean emotional support.
No, I'm purely emotional, but like, as the child gets older, maybe into their teens, that parent might be relying on them in the way they should be able to rely on their partner, kind of disclosing information that's inappropriate, talking about maybe their marriage, talking about
Let me ask you a question here, because some people use the term emotional incest. What do you think about that term? I think it's a loaded term, personally. I find it as a term, but
not for me. Incest, there's a lot of weight in that word.
Yeah,
incest.
I agree.
I do think, you have to see it from the context of Mary's mother, who's got 9 kids, an husband, and she's trying to just make her way in the world. And okay, it is completely inappropriate that she's leaning on her daughter to, help her, but that's what Mary has to do. So
I'm going to broaden that context, because I think there are some important sociological and political statements to make, because these women are existing in a culture or context which is allowing this to happen and not providing appropriate support. So if we had interventions, proper social services interventions in that context, those mechanisms, those survival mechanisms may not emerge, and we know they wouldn't actually. We know that. And it's also in the context, and people should understand this, and because it's been Father's Day recently, and I want to sort of make these points, that humans, unlike most mammals, have investment from the father in child rearing.
Yes.
There's only 5% of mammals that do that, and humans do it, and there are specific reasons why. And of the primates, we're the only primates to have that. And the reason for that is our babies are born too soon, as a biological fact, and we have to spend a long time nurturing them because of the size of our brains. It happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, and what's happened is certain types of social structures have damaged those relationships profoundly and deeply, and you can go right back to the Industrial Revolution, etc. So again, I think understanding the context is really important, because we often get into victim blaming, unfortunately. And I think our profession has also been sort of party to that at times as well.
Well, absolutely. But, you do have to take, context is everything.
Right.
And so, and that's really important what you brought up, Noel. It is true, like I think about that all the time. You're in the human condition, your children are dependent on you for like far longer than any other animal. In fact,
absolutely,
like all their lives, really. Like where, in fact, like every other animal rears its child, and once it's about 6 months old, they're like, right, off you go now. That's the end of you. Go on, and like they might never see them again, sort of so to speak. But obviously in the human dynamic and the way the society is structured, we are this family unit. Fathers and mothers, are there. That's the old kind of unit. Now things have changed, thank goodness, and things are a lot more flexible than they used to be. But if you were talking about Holy Catholic Ireland in the 70s and the 80s, you really, like, were there even any social services back then? What like the social worker was only going to come and see you if you were, like, obviously if there was severe neglect or something really wrong. I certainly don't remember being aware of anything like that back in the day. Now, there were charities and there were other people who did things, but really it was the church and your family, and that was about it, So
let's go back to Mary and her story. So
yes.
Mary is the child carer, as we would say.
Yes.
And she's in this position where she's providing emotional support to mom. It's all understandable. There's mess and chaos in the family. And she becomes a bit too self-reliant, a bit too.
Now, but let's go back to, you mentioned earlier, like the Constitution. So, what's nature and what's nurture. So we're talking about the environment that Mary grew up in. But Mary was very likely, her personality type, and there is a very, very stable and common personality type across disordered eating. And that's that client is usually that high achieving, perfectionistic, all or nothing kind of, I'm either doing it all right or all wrong, sort of. That's the default. And so Mary takes on this idea in her own mind that she has to rely on herself. She must do everything right. Now, that could be coming from, don't make dad kick off. Don't,
very sensible, wise decision. Right.
So again, nature versus nurture, there's a lot of crossover, but she would also be that kind of personality type where, it's taking on a lot of responsibility, taking responsibility for herself, wanting to do everything right. And again, she's also very aware that her mum is dealing with her dad and with other responsibilities. And so in her 8-year-old mind, she can't burden her mum with her problems or her concerns or talk to her mum about what's going on, because her mum has enough to be doing. Okay. Now and imagine how intelligent that child has to be to like, this is their way of interpreting what's happening and what they need to do in order to A, survive, and B, protect their mum. Like, taking on this massive role at like 8, 9, 10 years of age. I would have had many male clients as well, Noel, and again, if we're talking about alcoholism, and alcoholism is not the only problem that we see, obviously, but very often my male clients would say that, I had to go down the town and go and find my dad every Saturday night and bring him home from the pub.
Well, so it was my job on a Friday night to get his wage packet.
11-year-old Alan is...
That's right.
Going down the village and in and out of every pub, and every barman knows him, and no, your dad's not here, and, looking for his dad to bring him home. This kind of thing.
I never bothered with my dad. He was never coming home, just needed the wage packet more than anything else.
Back
in the day when he had cash, it's all changed now, of course.
You got it in a brown envelope.
That's right,
handed your wages in a brown envelope. In fact, I worked in the bank at one point, and we used to hand out people. I worked in Tala, and there were a lot of factories in Tala, and we literally would hand out the wages, like people with their wages in cash in an envelope. We would literally give them an envelope when they come in to get their wages, cash their wage check. And of course, some people went to the pub, and of course, some people went to the bookies, and then of course, some people went home, and did whatever they were going to do.
So the story sees kids are sort of high achievers, they're intelligent, they're overly responsible. That's probably why they become responsible, because of the intelligence and the overachievement. They feel responsible because all children do. They're all children are egocentric. They want to help out. They want to reduce conflict. How does that lead to this sort of emotional eating?
Well, there's a couple of different ways that this happens in this context, Noel. And the first one is that the child learns that on a very simple level in our brain, if we're full of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, eventually our brain is going to trigger us to do something to try and alleviate that stress. And so people learn that if they eat high fat, high sugar, high salt food, it produces a dopamine response in the brain. So it releases dopamine, and that calms us down.
Yeah.
So on a very basic biological level, we learn that if we get too stressed and we eat high sugar, high fat, high salt foods, it calms us down. That's on a biological level. But interestingly,
And so just so people understand this, we're programmed as a species to eat those things because we need them to live. So the sugar, the carbs, the fat, the salt, you've talked about dying of a heart attack because you don't have enough salts in your body, etc., etc. So as a species, and so they're highly rewarded neurologically, but that's what people need to understand.
Correct.
So when you do these behaviors, your brain goes, well done, good behavior, well done. And so you have these quite very strong messages saying, well done, good, well done, reinforcing, and it makes you feel good, right?
Well, as a child, your brain is going, eat this because if you don't calm down, we're going to explode. You know, like we're actually like, I can't take any more stress. I can't take any more cortisol. So get the dopamine so that I can calm down. That's what the body's trying to do. It learns that the stress response, you know, can be to eat and to calm the body down. As we get older then, actually, I'll talk about when we get older in 1 second, because that is important. But the other thing that happens, and again, I would have heard this so often.
Yeah.
If a client, again, let's talk about Mary. Mary's dad gets the wage packet on a Friday night and goes down the pub and is gone for the night.
Yeah.
And Mary and her mum know that Friday night is the one night that dad is out. And very often, Mary and her mum might have sat down and treated themselves on a Friday night and had a bar of chocolate or had the sweets or had the treats.
Exactly, right.
And so Mary has learned that, you know, sweets are rewarding and, you know, sugar is rewarding and it's a treat and it's a way of, her mum is showing her love by giving her this, you know, nice food, and they're sharing this treat and having this little secret, maybe from dad, that they, you know, did this thing. So that's very common.
You get that maternal bond or relational bond as well as the sugar.
Yeah. So like there's a huge emotional attachment to the act of eating food. It reminds them of a time when they were close to their mom, and that, you know, it was love. Like it was.
Thinking neurologically, that's the oxytocin. So you get the dopamine rush to calm you down. You get the oxytocin, which is the bonding love hormone.
Yeah, exactly. And then
we should say that like early food experiences are very much like that anyway. Infants, whether you're being bottle fed or breastfed, it's irrelevant. You're still physically being held. Somebody's looking at you in the eyes, producing that oxytocin bonding hormone. And so these are really primitive early experiences that get reinforced in dysfunctional settings later.
And not only that, but because they're so early and they are pre-verbal, as you say, like the very first experience you have of being comforted and being fed, you know, someone, as you say, is holding you, looking you in the eye, you know, this is why I can so quickly go into the unconscious and become an autopilot. So saying to somebody, you know, just like eat less, move more, stop, you know, eating, get rid of all the chocolate and you'll be fine.
I'm aware of time. We're running out of time. We're getting very technical, but the word unconscious often gets associated with the form of therapy that's not very useful, which is psychoanalysis. I prefer the term, I don't know what you think, I prefer the term automation, which is what you would, the brain has this fantastic ability to make our lives easy by giving us automatic ways of doing things. Because if we had to consciously think about stuff all the time, we'd go completely bonkers. We wouldn't be able
to... no, 100%. Like 40% of what we do every day is autopilot. Like it's, you know, we're not even thinking about it. So I've been able to drive 15 minutes down the road.
That's right.
You get out of the car and you go, I can't remember the last 15 minutes. Like anything could have happened on that road. I have no idea, because you're so used to doing it. So the same thing, your brain files away. Like when I get stressed and the cortisol goes up, I eat food and it calms me down, and that's an autopilot. So your conscious mind, you might consciously be saying, I've got to stop eating chocolate, I've got to lose weight, I've got to stop, you know, kind of doing this.
But the real boss, the automation,
it's way beyond your conscious control. And unless you're actually getting help, which is part of what we do, obviously, is helping people to break that unconscious, break that autopilot, and bring it into conscious awareness so that you can stop it, you know, consciously. Because
you use your conscious mind for what it's designed to do, which is make a decision to do something different and then maintain that decision to do something different long enough so that you automate the new difference.
Yes, but you also have to be able to spot the autopilot kicking in for that's the hardest part. And again, we have tools that do that, but it's to explain it to client when you actually explain things. And this is a very enjoyable podcast episode because we're explaining things as we go along. And this is a lot of what we do with clients when we're in we're just being very real and very practical and saying, this is because blah, blah, blah. And this is connected to your past because blah, blah, blah. And that's not where you live anymore. But your brain actually still lives in the past. That's the problem. The brain hasn't got the memo that we don't still live in that situation, that we don't still need to be doing it. And actually we can do something different.
Fantastic.
The other thing that's important, though, is obviously
we are going to run out of time, folks. I can't tell you how this is manna from heaven. Listening to my colleague here, this is exactly what you need to hear. It's such a message of hope around this stuff because people are doomed by these, and it's that doom is reinforced by charismatic types out there selling nonsense. Right, this stuff is really understandable. And you can do something about it, and you can transform your life and transform your relationship to yourself and food. And I'm going to stop the explanation there. Maybe bring you back another time so we can delve deep more into it. But just I'm aware of. Go on, you finish that point. Yeah.
No, I know you're recording this, so
it's fine. No, carry on.
Probably cut this bit out. I said I would have to finish at 9:15, so we do have a bit more time.
Oh, right. Okay, that's fine.
We have it at 9, yeah.
It's it. No, it's goes out the way it goes out. That's fine. Thank you for correcting me. I'll be less anxious now about trying to get you moving on. So carry on with the explanation. So we've got this automation process.
Yeah. So
part of the work is just making people aware of all these processes, right?
Yes. However, the other confounding factor comes into disordered eating is the actual nutrition piece of it and the actual eating itself. Okay, so if our client has started eating, comfort eating or emotional eating, over time, obviously that's going to have an impact on their body, on their weight, etc. And what happens then is, as I suppose a teenager and an adult, the client is trying to compensate by dieting or restriction. Now, not at the level of bulimia restriction, but like restricting or dieting. And so then one of the triggers is actually hunger. So the client is not eating enough. And you did refer earlier on, and you were very right now, because I say high sugar, high fat, high salt foods. We need all three of those flavors or those sensations or those, those actual flavors going into our mouth. We crave those because back in the day, like cavemen, sugar, fat, and salt were very rare. Like we could eat as many plants as we wanted, but like to actually find and kill an animal to get our fat, for example, or to find a hive like and bees and to be able to get honey, for sugar, or salt, again, like the animals, in the savannah go to the salt lick. We need salt, we need fat, we need sugar, we crave it and we want it. The food
that lifestyle wasn't so far away. It's not that far off since we were subsistence farmers. And it wasn't just simply about we think of hunter-gatherers being hundreds of thousands of years, but actually when we were tenant farmers, which was in living memory in Ireland, to be honest, and in the UK, farming naturally, growing your own food, you would grow a lot of high fiber vegetables and fruits, but growing an animal would take a lot of that stuff away from you. So animals, where you got a lot of protein, high protein, and also people don't realize. I mean, there's like in Shakespeare wrote a play about a king's daughter giving him salt.
Yes.
The reason she gave him salt is because salt was hard to come by, and it would save his life. And he didn't recognize that, and then he disowned her, right? So these things are highly prized by our bodies.
Yes.
And that's what makes sense of what seems like an insane situation.
Yes. And your body hasn't got the memo that there's sugar, fat, and salt all around you all day long. It still, craves those things and it wants those things. So if somebody's on a diet, they're usually cutting out sugar,
those things,
cutting out fat, and they might be taking in salt because a lot of processed food has salt in it, and so your body is craving what you're not giving it. So it's going to trigger you into eating. So one of the things that I think is very important for all that emotional eating, binge eating disorder, any form of disordered eating, really, it is a mental health issue. A lot of it is tied back to trauma or adverse childhood experience. You need to be going to somebody who is trained in this area and knows what they're doing. Because for us, it's equally important to help the client do the nutritional rehabilitation piece. And a lot of what we have to do is reset the gut, reset the body, get rid of all the food rules, because our clients have been the Weight Watchers, Slimming World, Operation Transformation, Jenny Craig, Lighter Life, Bright Line Eating. You know, they've gone to the gym, they've personal trainers, they've probably had liposuction, they've had meals delivered to the door, they've drunk shakes, they have done everything. And of course, they're looking for the
help. There's a lot of people putting their hands up in the audience and going, yeah, been there, done that, got that t-shirt.
You know, but they're looking for the help in the wrong place, because a diet is never the answer. That is not the answer. You must do the inner work first. You must actually, you know, we separate food from feelings. So we have to just bring food into, we just say food is morally neutral. Food isn't good or bad. Food's just food. Like of course there's food that's not good for you, but like food in and of itself is not bad. It just is. That's right. So to reset that relationship, to understand that food is necessary, food is fuel, food is medicine, but it's not connected to your feelings. But we need to build up a toolkit of resources that the client can use instead of food in order to be able to handle and manage their feelings. And they often need help in learning how to handle and manage their feelings. Because let's go back to Mary. And if her dad was violent or often angry, Mary is a client who does not know how to deal with anger, will often kind of say, I don't do conflict, I never get angry, she won't get angry, and she can't stand anybody else around her getting angry either. So very often we use when we talk about clients and their presentation, if we say, you know, are you a people pleaser, clients will very often resonate with that phrase. Because again, Mary learned at a younger age to put somebody else's needs ahead of her own. Like it was all about her dad, really, or her mom, and they came first, and they were more important than her, and she had to keep her stuff to herself because, you know, mom and dad had enough going on. So that phrase people pleaser it could sound anything from just, you know, kind of quite benign to actually disrespectful, but actually there's a much deeper kind of connection to the past going on. When somebody puts everybody else's needs ahead of their own, there's very often a history there where they learned that was a safety behavior. You know, that kept them safe when they actually tuned in more to what was going on for the other person than into themselves.
And also, I'd see what you think about this as well, because I also think about that dynamic in terms of, like, all kids, and most people don't know this, but all kids put their parents first because they depend upon them for their survival. That's built into us. So it's a sane survival strategy to try and make sure your parents survive before you, because somewhere, you know, it's built into you that, and there are only 5 things we're born with, right? Sucking, grasping, rooting, tracking, smiling, and those social things of smiling. Why do we practice smiling in utero? Because Mother Nature's built it into us that we're social animals. It's on our social connections that we depend. From day one, postpartum, we grin at everybody around us. Think about a baby grinning. Everybody just goes, oh, that's beautiful. Oh, yeah, I don't mind changing your stinky nappy because you make me smile. And it's the most fundamental thing. So people pleasing, I think it's a useful term, but we depend on that postpartum. From the day we're born, we depend on making people like us to get our needs met.
And what we see then is that clients very much do put other people ahead of themselves. They find it very difficult to be assertive. They find it very difficult to have good boundaries. Again, if you think about somebody growing up with somebody who was chaotic, unpredictable, whether it was alcoholism, whether it was mental illness, whether it was something else, you know, the client is very concerned with making sure that they stay safe. So eating, like emotional eating and binge eating, is very much a safety behavior. And a lot of clients are running.
Hence the connection to trauma work, because
they're very stressed.
The core of trauma work is giving people better ways of feeling safe, you know, more effective ways of feeling safe.
And so we separate the food from the feelings, and we're helping the client actually just eat food as food, and doing a lot of, we have to do physical work too, because a lot of our clients are struggling with physical conditions, and particularly gut conditions, as you can appreciate. There's IBS, there's colitis, there's leaky gut, there's reflux, there's, you know, all sorts of things. And then we see other co-occurring conditions. It could be thyroid, it could be very common in infertility, actually, endometriosis and PCOS, very common that clients would also have emotion eating or binge eating coping strategies, so there's a lot of health related, actual physical health related work that needs to be done as well. And that's a bit that a lot of the mental health services miss when it comes to emotional binge eating is they, if we resolve the trauma,
it's not just emotional
food
binge
will
eating.
resolve itself. And
yeah, it's not just emotional binge eating. It's right across the health spectrum for anybody with mental health issues. The mental health professionals are just not dealing with the physical health issues.
Right.
Absolutely, right across.
But the physical health care system isn't dealing with the mental health issues.
No, it's just such a split, isn't it?
And that's the problem that I have. You have people with type 2 diabetes. 38% of people with type 2 diabetes meet the criteria for binge eating disorder. 60% of patients for bariatric surgery meet the criteria for binge eating disorder.
Yeah.
And yet in any of those services, they will rarely be even asked about the relationship with food.
Yeah.
And if they disclose that they have a disordered relationship with food, it usually excludes them from treatment. And they're sent off somewhere else over there.
Means stomach stapling in
well, it's a very different version. Yes,
people call it. Yeah.
Or to have the stomach reduced in some way. Yeah. So,
okay. I'm going to move us on if that's all right, because you've done a fantastic job at explaining these issues and why it's important to see somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's a whole bunch of stuff that mix in, and it's also because it is maybe uniquely a condition that demands that the practitioner bring in the health, the mental health, a holistic approach, right?
Yes.
And the ACEs are really important. So it's like the training, the needs, the qualifications, because as we said prior to the show, you can't just say to people, stop eating.
No. No.
You're going to carry on having
that doesn't work, unfortunately.
That's right. Unlike if you've got a problem with alcohol, you can just say, well, stop drinking. You won't have the problem with it, right? But that's not true of food. And it's about getting it better. But it is a complicated thing because our relationship to food is complicated, full stop. Yeah. Body neutrality, I presume, is something that you'll bring in as well as food neutrality. But yeah, because just feeling neutral about your body rather than my body shape is a good or bad, it's just my body. And I have thoughts about how I want my body to function, and that's a health issue and more than anything else. And also activity, like I like climbing mountains. I need a certain level of fitness to be able to climb mountains. That's fact. Yeah. Neutral fact. We are coming to the point where you're going to have to go off, and I don't want to keep you over time because it's all about boundaries. Except when you get really excited. Except when you get really excited. I don't want to stop. So tell me about Eating Freely, what services you provide, how people can get hold of you, who you work with, and all of that. So give me that elevator pitch now.
So yeah, I was so I started off as practitioner in private practice. I went back to college at the age of 30, so it's like 25 years ago now. I can't believe it. Yeah. I retrained, did a degree in psychology, did a postgrad in counseling psychotherapy. Yeah. And from the get-go, even when I was just doing my studies, I was really drawn to eating disorders, doing essays on them and research and projects. And I didn't really know why, to be honest, because I never struggled with an eating disorder myself. And as I said, I had worked on the airlines. I'd seen a lot of disordered eating. I had a very good friend of mine in my childhood who had an eating disorder, but it wasn't anywhere on my radar that this was the area that I actually wanted to work in. But I was just drawn to it from the get-go. And years later, when I was practicing psychotherapist, I was in supervision. So all therapists have to go to supervision regularly, to kind of therapy for the therapist, so to speak. Yeah. And I actually said to my supervisor, like, I have no idea why I work in eating disorder. Like, I honestly feel like it's a vocation. Like, this is what I'm meant to be doing, but I don't really understand why. And she looked at me and she started laughing. And she said, but Emma,
those annoying people do.
Yeah. You get the clients you need.
Yeah.
And she pointed out to me, and I mean, like, talk about not being aware. I share the exact personality type of eating disorder clients. I am that perfectionistic, high achieving, all or nothing, highly self-critical.
High achieving you? I mean, really?
No, back in the day, I mean,
I did well.
I've done a lot of work on myself since, but like back in the day, I was a card carrying, personality type. The people,
Oh, great.
their lack of boundaries, lack of assertiveness, very poor at self-care, like I said, reiki shreiki, all of that, like that was me to a T. And through through working with clients for, 12, 13, 14, I was probably 14 years actually actively practicing. And the majority of the clients who were coming into me were emotional binge eating clients.
Yeah.
And through my own working with the clients, so my professional development, my learning, my training that I did to be able to work with clients, and my own personal development, which is part and parcel of being a therapist, to continue doing your own personal work and working on yourself, going to therapy, going to other things, doing your own work. I learned a lot of tools and a lot of interventions that worked for clients. And I am quite a pragmatic person, and I'm a systems sort of thinker, and I put together a program for my clients. Now, the other thing to say is that disordered eating, it is not a sexy area of therapy for therapists to want to work in,
No?
because there's still a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of a lack of knowledge around it. And even practicing, health professionals you say eating disorders and they think anorexia, and they also think about clients with anorexia, highly resistant, difficult to work with, difficult to treat, which none of which is true. It is true, but it's not true. On the face of it, it's true, but it's actually not true. But it's very difficult to find a good qualified eating disorder professional.
Yeah.
And so I was really busy, and my practice was getting bigger and bigger. I was getting overwhelmed. I had a waiting list. And again, I spoke to my different supervisor this time, Charlie. And I said, Charlie, I don't know what to do. I actually think I'm getting burnt out. I have a waiting list, and I'm the only person in Cork who does this or whatever. Not the only person, but
Yeah.
Whatever. And he said, when you work for yourself in private practice, you don't have a boss, you don't have a line manager, there's no director of services. So who's going to give you a promotion? Like if you worked in a hospital, you'd be promoted up through the ranks,
Yeah.
But because you work in private practice, you just sit in your chair and you see the clients, and that's the end of it. So he said, you have to give yourself a promotion. So if you're going to give yourself a promotion, what would that look like? And that was just like a huge light bulb moment for me. And I was like, I've developed this program, I've developed this sort of system, I suppose, way of working with people. I could teach a couple of my colleagues to use the program, and then I'd be able to refer people to them. And then there'd be, more of us who'd be able to do this work. And that's actually how it started. In 2016, I trained 2 of my colleagues to use the program, Eating Freely. I wasn't called Eating Freely at the time, to use my program. And they really loved it. They understood it. They got it. Their clients did very well with it. And that was how it started. I was training other therapists part-time. So my training business was on the side to my private practice. And it just meant that I was getting more and more practitioners out there who knew what they were doing. Everybody's fully qualified. It's very important to me that we only train fully qualified health professionals who come into us now for advanced CPD training. And that's what our training is. And we got to 2019. We were just about, in the early 2020, we were just about to start going to the UK and Australia.
And then Mother Nature had other idea.
And then COVID happened, and that was the end of that. So we put the training online, because we were doing training the old-fashioned way. We were going to a hotel and having people in a group. So we are now training practitioners all around the world. Now, I say all around, that sounds like we're training hundreds of people every day. We're not. We train practitioners in groups of 10 over a 12-week period. They are already qualified health professionals, and we give them the tools and expertise that they need to be able to deliver the Eating Freely program to clients where they are.
And there's enough flexibility so people can adapt it to their cultural circumstances.
Because every practice, we could be training a health and wellness coach in the US who's board certified. We could be training a nutritional therapist. We could be training a psychologist. We even have had doctors and diabetes educator, nurses. We've all sorts of different practitioners, as well as psychotherapists like myself. So they can take the program, bring it back to where they're working, adapt it and integrate it into what they're already doing, or they can just use it as a standalone, like done for you sort of program that they, if they're happy enough to use it like that, they can do it that way.
Right.
We're now doing research. We are partnered with Leeds Beckett University and the Obesity Institute there.
Wow.
they're actually running an initial pilot up in the north of England, very much around based on the feedback of lived experience. So people who are with lived experience of living in a larger body and going through the obesity healthcare services. And they all say, the problem is between my ears. What about the trauma? There's no mental health, what the psychology, PTSD. They mention all of these things, and the medical pathways don't give that help. So this is what we're working on with Leeds Beckett, is that we want to actually see the specialist mental health support needed integrated into the medical healthcare pathway, so that if somebody comes in with any sort of weight-related issue, that they are assessed, and if they meet the criteria for binge eating disorder, they should be receiving specialist support from somebody who's been trained to give it to them.
Yeah. I just want to say, so that people get this, and I don't often talk about personal experience, but like I grew up in a highly traumatizing home, Mary's home, but I'm Noel, right? That's the home I grew up in. And I remember having to work through my relationship to food to understand that, because when I felt hungry, I would feel terrified. I didn't realize I was just feeling hungry. I felt terrified. And that's really where it's at. And understanding that level of programming and going, actually, it's just hunger, it's not terror.
Yeah.
And then I can make different decisions. And the feelings of fear and anxiety about not medicating through food, I think about it as medicating through food.
Yeah.
I can then take those feelings where they need to go, which is to another human being that understands me.
Yes.
And that's the breakthrough that people need in this, really.
Yeah.
It's to understand that, because those children with ACEs and later life trauma as well, I think, has the same impact.
Yes, yeah.
You disconnect from that natural method of getting help, which is getting a cuddle from somebody that loves you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Finding that trustworthy person that can emotionally put their arms around you and say, there, it's all right. Once you've got that, everything else is beginning to fall into place. So, look, we need to finish there. How do people get hold of Eating Freely? Have you got a website?
We have a website, eatingfreely.com. We are on Facebook. We're on Instagram, Eating Freely Program.
Well,
I have...
I came across you on LinkedIn, so Emma's on LinkedIn.
I'm on LinkedIn. Any professionals who are interested in training in this area, please come to us, because we need more professionals who know what they're doing in this area.
Emma does respond to LinkedIn, because that's all I did was I saw her on LinkedIn. I sent a message saying, would you want to come on my podcast? And
I
she
actually
said,
do
yeah,
answer all my direct messages on LinkedIn. You're right, Noel, I do.
Unlike me, I don't. So that's very... I have to say, what a pleasure it's been to meet you this morning. I'd like to bring you back on another time. Maybe we'll have more of a personal conversation, but we got caught up in the conversation about this issue and the technicalities of it. And I think that's really, really important, that people understand some of this stuff and get educated with these terms, and that, because it's, the mortality rates are unforgivable.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is with binge eating disorder, and that's why it's not taken so seriously, is there isn't a mortality rate associated with binge eating. But it certainly has very serious health consequences over time. So again, talking about type 2 diabetes, talking about people needing...
I was going to say, I would challenge that, because I think mortality is labelled in a different way, but it's coming from this.
Yeah.
So we have wards up in the north of England that are chopping people's legs off because of type 2 diabetes. And that's all emotional binge eating disorder. That's all it is.
And I would bring cardiac in there too, Noel. And I've tried to find research into cardiac rehabilitation programs that also offer support around emotional binge eating, and there just isn't. It's like the cardiac care industry.
It's because it presents medically as obesity, as diabetes, as these things, and the disconnect between a strictly medical model and a strictly psychological model, and that interface, that's where it's at. We're at 14 minutes past. We're going to have to stop there. Thank you so much for coming on. You stay there.
Thank you for having me. Really
I hope everybody has found this as insightful and interesting and useful as I have, just as a personal level, because it reflects some of my personal journey, but it is a broad issue that as society we're dealing with, and it needs to be taken far more seriously than it is. Thank you so much. I'll see you all the next show. You take care. Have a great day.